strategic industries.
Ms. Gibson, can I just start with you? You stated in your testimony that we know China produces about 9% of our generic drugs, which is a lot. But do you have any sense of how many of our drugs involve Chinese production? In other words, maybe they're not made wholly there, but Chinese production's involved.
Thousands. Thousands of our generic drugs and even some of the brand name products and perhaps even new therapies for coronavirus may depend on the chemicals that are sourced primarily in China. And if you're hospitalized with coronavirus, if you have a severe case, which thankfully is very rare, is small numbers of people, small percentage, you might be on a ventilator. So you'll need sedatives like fentanyl and propofol. Your blood pressure may get dangerously low, so you'll need pressors like dopamine or epinephrine. You might get a secondary infection, bacterial in nature, and you'll need antibiotics. You might become septic, which is life-threatening. I was sitting in a room with the people that actually make medicines. These are the men and women in pharmaceutical engineering, pharmaceutical chemistry. I said, so tell me, if you have to make these tomorrow, where do the core chemicals come from to make it? How much are we dependent on China? And they said 90% of the chemicals to make those basic generic drugs depend on China.
Just to make it clear here, is it correct to characterize the decision to move the production of penicillin overseas as an economic decision? It was economically driven. It was a profit-driven decision. Is that your understanding?
Yes, sir. I think the point of Made in China 2025 is essentially to destroy the free market and create incentives to offshore production in China. And originally this seemed like a good thing. We'll save prices. We'll move value where value can be moved. We'll continue to do the innovation. But China is scooping that up as well. And so without any decision by any government authority, this happened, and now we are going to deal with the consequences. And of course, an antibiotic isn't instrumental to treat a virus, but the respiratory infection, it is.
Right. It just strikes me as my last comment, Mr. Chairman, that our current drug policy seems to privilege economic considerations of maybe a few companies over public health considerations. Is that fair to say, Mr. Morrison?
I would largely agree, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The testimony of Morrison and Gibson, I wish every senator could read that, because clearly this is a national security issue. It's not just pharmaceuticals. It is rare earth metals. I mean, I can go through the things that should something more major in terms of a conflict between us and China breaks out, that it would cripple our economy, our health and well-being and safety. And so this idea that it's a free market, when I know this from New Jersey, that people are luring companies to manufacture over in China. And so again, knowing here we are in a time of crisis, it's too late. Shouldn't we as a federal government be doing more on these issues to make sure we are building manufacturing capacity here? Ms. Gibson.
Yes, what we can do and what small businesses want to do to prevent a future situation with drug shortages, they want to make the active ingredients, which is what makes a medicine medicine. They can make it fully here in the United States using advanced manufacturing technology. Stockpile that because it lasts longer than the finished drugs. And if we have another coronavirus outbreak, have a stand-up facility ready to go, which we have with, companies have these as backup, redundant capability. Take that API out and make those medicines that are in critical shortages. There are small businesses that can start production of active ingredients made here in the United States. They could start within weeks. It would take maybe 9 months to start making small quantities of these key ingredients fully made in the United States, not dependent on China for chemicals. They could do that in about 9 months.
Mr. Morrison.
And they could start for the stockpile DOD and VA, use our government purchasing power to stimulate that market.
That's effectively where I was going, sir. You have tremendous purchasing power through Medicare, Medicaid, TRICARE, the Department of Veterans Affairs. These are some of the largest healthcare consumers in the world. You can control their procurement regulations. And if I could just make one more pitch. Right now, the federal government may be about to allow the TSP-I fund to invest in the MSCI index. We are going to be investing in Chinese enterprises. I've worked 19 years for the federal government. Please don't put my pension in non-transparent Chinese companies.
And so I just want to just make a massive appeal to my chairman right now that this should be a committee urgency. This is not, we can address this. It's actually not that hard. We just don't have the collective will. This is a national security crisis that one of our serious adversaries is doing things strategically to undermine our health and economic well-being, which at any point they could cripple our economy. And actually this has a win-win. It corrects for a national security crisis, and it actually helps our overall economy. And the fact that they're doing it and we're not. So I just appeal to the chairman and the ranking, let's work on this as a project. This is an obvious area where we should have bipartisan commitment to fill these vulnerabilities and actually build more American economic manufacturing.
Absolutely, and that is the goal of the second tranche of work we're going to have to do on this. So we're trying to figure out what can we do to help assist small business quickly right now. But we're going to have to come back and do more on a host of issues. This hearing has actually been scheduled for over a month and a half before this really. So we already identified this in our report last year, and I agree with you. There are still a couple people that debate whether we have a supply chain issue. I'm not sure they'll be able to make that argument here any longer.
On February 27th, the FDA pointed out that it had received its first notification from a drug manufacturer about a drug shortage. And I'm sorry I didn't hear all of the testimony earlier from Ms. Gibson and Dr. Anderson, so you may have referenced this. But the question that I have is, how do we balance the public's need to know on an issue like that without it creating a run on those drugs and a real panic about how to respond to that kind of situation?
I think the FDA did the right thing in not naming the medicine, because that would have contributed to hoarding and precluded the opportunity to allocate it to those people who need it the most. But I also think we've had drug shortages in this country for more than 20 years, and we haven't been honest about the impact that it's had on patients. So at some point, maybe when we get through this, we have to have an honest conversation about the shortages of medicines in this country, the terrible impact it has, what the real root causes are, and address those.
So the
Dr.
FDA,
Anderson.
so the FDA says there's about 100 drugs. At places like Johns Hopkins, we know there are 250, 300 drugs that are on shortage. And we sort of borrow it from the University of Pennsylvania and then pay it back to the Mayo Clinic and do all sorts of bartering on this when there is, in fact, a shortage. But this is not a new thing.
Mr. Morrison, I would just like to share your concern about investment of the thrift savings plan and the MSCI index, using that as the index for how to make those investments. Senator Rubio and I have been beating that drum for a while without much support from the administration.
Time is running out.
Thank you.
Just on that point, we have reason to believe that they've actually expedited moving in that direction. It's just crazy. It's crazy. I don't know. I mean, I know it's not a term that you normally use like to describe public policy, but this is nuts. Taking the retirement funds of federal employees in the military to be invested in companies in China that are actively working to undermine our national security, our healthcare security, and our economic security. It just can't happen. I mean, it's just, if it wasn't so serious, you would laugh at it and say, that can't be true. That's something from the Inquirer, or whatever. But it's real, and hopefully we can see action taken on this promptly, among other things. So let me begin by saying I'm a big believer in capitalism. I'm a big believer in free markets, and one of the reasons I am is because I believe it provides for the most efficient allocation of capital to the most productive place. However, there are times in which the most efficient allocation of capital does not align with our national interests. And in those times in which it doesn't align with our national interests, it is incumbent upon public policymakers to make adjustments. So we are now facing that. And for many months and years, we've been making this conversation, and we've been talking about this in conversation with people, and the answer, always was that either A, denial that a problem existed, or accusing this of being some sort of rejection of the market. But now I think, or it was theoretical. now it is no longer theoretical. We have before us, just in the healthcare and medical field, a market decision that it was more efficient, that you can do it at lower costs, despite transportation and everything else, if you made these things somewhere else. And that's what the market did, destroying jobs and companies here and providing that there. And this is all couched now in some anti-China narrative and so forth, but it really isn't. I mean, there's a national security component to the fact that China's a geopolitical near-peer competitor. But beyond it is the reality that even if they didn't do it on purpose, the shutdown of factories because of an outbreak of this virus has impacts that end up hurting us here. DOD and VA requirement to buy American on key components and drugs, and the court ruled against it. And so this requires a legislative fix.
Correct.
And there is hopefully any moment now or any day now an executive order issued by the White House that will strengthen these Buy American requirements, because now the federal government, in addition to driving the investment, one of the things that will drive investment is that there's a customer that's going to buy it, and we can be a big customer in some sectors.
Right.
Again, that's not government ownership of the means of production, okay, that's what socialism is, but it is government saying it's in our national interest to do these things. This is not even protectionism. This is security. So I hope we can fix that.
If I may
There's more to
add, Senator Rubio, and thank you for your leadership on this, we wouldn't have our aircraft carriers or military equipment, fully made in China. If we wanted to do a free market, we could do that and just outsource all of that, but we realize that there's a point which we don't want to cross. I will say that if we want to have manufacturing here in the United States for our essential drugs as a national security issue, if we look at how we've been making medicines, it's the same way we've been doing it 100 years ago. We have the opportunity to bring manufacturing home to make it more efficient, less costly, and that will take some initial investment so the DOD and the VA can have all of their components made here in the U.S. Otherwise, if we just buy, and Civica has found this, Civica is still finding it still has to get the core ingredients from China. New types of manufacturing, we can bring all of it back to the United States.
Not only do you want to make more capital available for companies to stay afloat, but to the extent possible, we want to try to focus as much of that as possible, not just to small business writ large, but in specific critical industries that could help fill these gaps and that are tied to all this, which leads me to the question for you, Mr. Morrison, and that is, isn't one of the challenges we face now that the definition of a critical industry for the country has to be broader than it's historically been? Everyone will agree aircraft carriers and airplanes are things we need to make. It takes a little while to convince people that making forklifts or pharmaceutical ingredients that at an individual level may not mean anything to most people around this country, but in the cumulative have an enormous impact. Part of the challenge we have is identifying a much broader scope of what qualifies for a critical industry or critical supply need for the country in the 21st century, which is either we took for granted in the past or never had to address.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's exactly right. There's a reason that we've effectively lost the race for 5G. It's because we've relied on the market, and now there are no American companies left that do this work. The Chinese had a plan. They're on the cusp of their 14th five-year plan. They have Made in China 2025, and Made in China 2035 is about to come out. They have determined the strategic sectors that they want to dominate in the future economy. And what they do in the domestic market is they boost up the price, they restrict the ability for outside companies, American companies and other companies to compete, and then they provide all manner of trade promotion tools, zero interest loans to dominate export markets. And so our small businesses, our medium-sized businesses and other American ventures are playing by one set of rules, and the Chinese companies are playing by another set of rules. And in another realm of national security, we would call that unilateral disarmament.